I'm Rob Trasinski. This is Symposium, where we bring together people to have conversations about the nature of liberalism and a free society. My guests today are Claire Berlinski and Vivek Kelkar of the Cosmopolitan Globalist. Welcome, Claire. Welcome, Vivek.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Rob.
Now,
Pleasure to be here.
We're putting the global and globalist here because Claire's coming to us from Paris and Vivek from Mumbai, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, it's interesting. I was a number of years ago reading the memoirs of William Shirer, great early 20th century foreign correspondent. And he talked about putting together the very first World News Roundup, where they had broadcasting live on CBS radio to the living rooms of America. You had correspondents in London and Paris and Rome and Berlin, all in the same broadcast. And it was this amazing new technological thing. And now, less than 100 years later, we can sort of casually throw together our own World News Roundup here. Now, I want you to. I think that's important for Americans because we're very insular in our news habits. So I want to have you talk a little bit about what the goal and the approach of the Cosmopolitan Globalist is.
Well, you're right to say that Americans are very insular in their news habits, but this hasn't always been true. During the Cold War, during the days of the big three media cartel, ABC, CBS, NBC, 40% of the news hole was devoted to foreign news. Americans were exposed on a regular basis to news and information about what was going on overseas. The main newspapers, not just the main newspapers, but even small town newspapers, had the budget to send foreign correspondents overseas. And it was a mark of prestige for a small town newspaper to have a foreign correspondent who could cover things like a flood in Haiti or the sort of news that never makes it onto the American consciousness, the American scan now. And all of this has been completely upended by the internet. By the internet and by other social trends at the same time, but above all by the internet, which destroyed the media model, the economic model for media coverage, and made it possible for people to untangle all the different parts of a newspaper. A newspaper used to have the sports section, the comics, Dear Abby, and the foreign news. And editors didn't really know what people were buying the newspaper for, but they figured they should give them a good dose of all of them. Now we know that people are bought the newspaper for the sports section. And beyond that, they really didn't care about international news. And knowing this, knowing exactly how many people click on every part of a newspaper, has made it impossible for editors to justify paying foreign correspondents because we know that people don't click on those stories. And so foreign news has dropped off the headlines, it's dropped out of the broadcasts, and as a consequence, Americans really don't know what's going on overseas. And we think this is regrettable. And we think it's something that needs to be rectified, because how can America be a superpower when people don't know enough to give their democratic consent to what the government does overseas?
I find it interesting that at the same time, and I think for some of the same reasons that we've dropped international coverage or reduced international coverage, we've also reduced local coverage. And people found that actually, that's not just that people clicked on newspapers for the sports section, is also that they clicked on newspapers. Shows how thoroughly I'm immersed in the digital era. But people bought newspapers for the sports sections. They also bought it for the classified ads, right? So
Absolutely.
Now, if you want to get a job, if you want to buy a used car, you go somewhere else, and the internet has removed all that, and it hollowed out the local news reporting, and then also helped hollow out the international reporting. Now, at the same time, the internet makes it a lot easier if you are interested in international news. It makes it a lot easier to go find it.
That's absolutely right. It is there. The news is there, but people don't know where to find it. They are not exposed to it when they do a Google search. In fact, Google doesn't even return foreign language results at all. So they don't see at all this incredible richness of reporting that's being done in, say, St. Petersburg or Beijing, or Beijing less rich, I suppose. But they don't see what the party line is even in Beijing. And usually they receive their news through aggregators who aren't interested in bringing foreign news to them. On top of it, even though the state of machine translation is extraordinary now, way beyond what I expected it to be. In fact, I confidently predicted we'd never get anything like comprehensible machine translation. This was simply beyond an insoluble problem, but it turns out that it's not. We now have extraordinarily good machine translation, but you still don't see the machine translated results, even when you Google Russia. The news you get will all be English language reporting. You won't have the option of choosing original Russian language reporting. And we see this as a big opportunity because it's there. It's just not intelligently aggregated.
So tell me about what the Cosmopolitan Globalist is doing.
Well, Vivek, do you want to answer that?
Go ahead. Go right ahead.
Well, the idea was born of our observation that we're not reading the kind of news coverage we want to read. We're not reading serious analytical work written by people who are in the countries, who really know the countries they're reporting from, that isn't partisan, that isn't histrionic, that isn't meant to stir up a particular side of the culture war in any given country. And many countries have a culture war. It's not the same culture war, but the phenomenon seems to be related to the nature of the technology we're using. And we felt very strongly that it ought to exist, that there was enough of a market, that there were enough people who wanted to read news like this, that we could make a go of it, a serious go of it. And so we organized everything on Twitter. I just put out a call to people who want to see this kind of news platform created to come help me create it. And I was astonished by the response, because there are so many people who see why we need this and who want it to be in existence. And so far, we've been working entirely as a volunteer platform. No one's getting paid yet. We hope to be paid at some point, but so far this has just been a labor of love, and it's been a remarkable accomplishment in the very short time that we've been doing this. We've published one sensational article after another, and I'm so proud we have.
Now, here's where I give
people are listening. You can Google Cosmopolitan Globalist, and it will take you right to us, because absolutely no one else wants to be called the Cosmopolitan Globalist.
Well, that leads me to two things. I was going to give you an opportunity to plug your to give a web address, or I think Googling is the best thing. And the other thing I was going to ask about the name, because the name is sort of like an in-your-face challenge to the sort of nationalist outlook, universal nationalist outlook around the world.
Yes, it is. But I should say, we didn't set out to choose a name that would be quite so provocative, but all the unprovocative names were taken. So we were really sort of forced to find a name that no one wanted to have. And we're quite pleased that we did, because it does work on a number of levels, and it is distinctive.
Well, let's talk about that the idea of the cosmopolitan, you say there's a culture war in every country, and one of the universal aspects of that seems to be that the target there is the cosmopolitan globalists. So let's talk about what that epithet means, and the attitude behind it, and more broadly about the sort of challenge right now of authoritarian nationalism.
Yeah. Vivek, do you want to speak about that?
No, you start right ahead there, and then I'll butt in.
Right. Well, I mean, the epithet cosmopolitan and globalist goes back to Stalin, of course, who decried it. It was an anti-Semitic slur. The idea is that Jews are the ultimate cosmopolitans. Everywhere they go, they don't have they're rootless. They don't have real ties to the land. And this idea, the word has, both the cosmopolitan and globalist have been revived. I'm not sure whether consciously, when people use them, whether they understand the anti-Semitic associations, they understand how really disgusting these terms are, or whether they are just part of the collective unconsciousness in some way, such that during times of upheaval, people instinctively, in an almost Jungian way, come back to the idea of the cosmopolitan and the globalist as the traitor. It's a deeply dangerous idea, obviously, because it applies not only to Jews, but to people who are in some way international in their outlook, which is going to be people who run the commanding heights of the economy for obvious reasons, the heads of multinationals. It's also going to be diplomats. It's going to be people who are in some way connected to other countries and have an outlook that isn't narrowly domestic. Every country needs these people. You absolutely need them. If you persecute them or worse, extinguish them, which happens, I mean, the Khmer Rouge killed everyone with eyeglasses, you find out very quickly why they were important for your country. It's not a recipe for success. The rise in contempt and hatred for so-called cosmopolitan elites in America, of all places, has horrified me. I thought there was the one place where you wouldn't see this, where you could never see this, because America is the one country that doesn't suffer from these pathologies. I was completely wrong. America suffers from these pathologies just like every other country. But
well, yeah, I think in America, the shocking thing about it is America. I mean, as I think Margaret Thatcher famously said, America was the first country that was founded by philosophy. It was founded on a set of ideas rather than blood and soil. By as being the home of a particular region or the home of a particular race, America was founded as being based on universal ideas. And I think that's where the cosmopolitan globalist thing really comes in, is that, it's ironic that a communist, supposedly international communists coined it, but Solomon was really sort of pushing back towards a nationalist approach.
by that
And
point, yes, very much so.
Exactly. So the nationalist approach, I think, is very much uh, characterized by this idea of let's not have universal ideas. Let's appeal to the traditional prejudices and assumptions of whatever our home group is, the real Americans or the real French or the real Russians, or it can be applied anywhere around the world, the real people of your particular ethnic and local group. And we're going to appeal to the prejudices and the existing assumptions and existing beliefs and the traditions of that group. And, it's an attack on universal ideas. And I think that's why it seems so unfitting to America.
Yes, America's an enlightenment project, and these are counter-enlightenment ideals. I mean, Kant was the progenitor of the idea of cosmopolitanism as the ultimate virtue, as essential to the condition of peace and something toward which men should strive. And for a very long time in the United States, I think the United States saw itself as not just a nation of ideas, but a nation of enlightenment ideas specifically. What Adam Garfinkel has described, the positive sum values of the Scottish Enlightenment, the idea that you could have policies that benefit everyone. And it is very disturbing to see America, which I thought was a country I knew as well as my own face, become something that I don't think is American, that isn't natively American, and which I don't recognize. It's not everywhere in America, obviously, but there is a much larger market in America for anti-enlightenment ideas, blood and soil nationalism, and a kind of dark provincialism that simply isn't American, or isn't what I thought was American than I ever imagined. It's been deeply personally upsetting to me.
Well, it's been personally upsetting to me and professionally inconvenient because, I was sort of, I've been making my career largely among the sort of right of center world, and seeing the conservatives in America go from being classical liberals under influence of Enlightenment ideas to some extent. There's always been a mixture, to very much going towards a European style conservatism, the blood and soil nationalism. And I
Yes,
think
me
that
too.
when we're talking about the need to understand what's going on overseas, I think what we need to understand is the extent to which, America tends to view itself as we're an island here and we're not influenced by anything else. But the extent to which this kind of nationalist ideas and authoritarian nationalism that's spreading across the world is influencing and coming back and influencing us here.
I insist that Vivek answer one of these questions. The thing about Vivek and I as a team is that I am the talkative, impetuous, showy one, and Vivek is the slow, thoughtful one. And without Vivek things would be a complete catastrophe. But I want him to answer the question and not just let me barge in and do my thing.
Thank you, Claire. Uh, I was thinking about quite a few things while you were talking. For one, I didn't know the anti-Semitic association with Cosmopolitan Globalist, and that's really interesting. Two, I was looking back to what cosmopolitan might mean in an Indian sense of the word, and it struck me that the early Indian politicians post independence, immediately after independence, maybe the first or the second generation of politicians that came in, were cosmopolitan in their outlook. They were all people who had either been educated in Britain, or they were people who had some sort of links with Britain or America or somewhere in the West. It's known that our first Prime Minister, Nehru, was a Fabian socialist. The guy who wrote our constitution, or who was the architect of the constitution, Dr. Ambedkar, was a student at the London School of Economics and later did his PhD somewhere in the US. I can't remember which university. He studied law in the US. So he came back with a cosmopolitan outlook. It's been perhaps the last 20 or 30 years where there's been a bit of a reaction to this outlook, which is where, if you remember, we were discussing the term Khan market once, Claire.
Mm-hmm.
That's really used to describe a certain elite population here, or an elite set of people who are inclined to be leftist and perhaps over intellectual.
What was the term
And
again?
that's the way Khan market.
Khan market. It's a market in Delhi. A very upscale
it's a market in Delhi.
Got it.
Market in Delhi.
It's what would be the analog in the U.S. Maybe Greenwich Village.
Yeah, Greenwich Village, like Upper East Side. Yeah.
It's a bit like that. And so we've, over the last 20 years, we've gone into a kind of a parochial nationalism that's been really hard to understand for someone like me. I can't understand why we need to have it. We've gone back to saying, I have to use a regional language in my state. All right, I have to know that language. But then if all government communication is in that language, I can't figure it out because I don't speak so many languages. We've got 33 or something official languages.
More than that, right?
Yeah, but officially, I think it's 33 or something.
Right, and then there's many more in India. I mean, one of the things that the British Empire brought to India was English became the lingua franca, the way that sort of standard language anybody could use.
And it remains the link language, whether we like it or not. And we're just moving into an era where we're saying that we shouldn't be doing this. We should be going back to our roots. Yes, it's good to go back to our roots, but then television, the internet, everything comes and reflects this parochial nationalism that we see today.
You know, it's interesting. I mentioned that I'm talking to you in Mumbai. Now, I have a friend who grew up in Bombay and to this day refuses to call it anything but Bombay. And there was this whole sort of mania for a while of renaming Indian cities. And it's not just India. I mean, they've done this. It's become throughout the world, there's this thing of let's take these cities and change them from the names that they had under the British Empire and change them to something that's in a more local language as part of this parochialism.
Uh, I'm not surprised because I still, unless I'm consciously speaking to somebody about Mumbai, if I'm talking to just a friend over a drink or something, I'd still say Bombay. I'd still say Bombay. And I know that there's a whole lot of people here who still do that, and they're not necessarily a part of my generation. They're a lot younger. They would have been about 10 years old when the name was changed to Mumbai, but they would still call it Bombay. And and one example of this name change that we've had in the last 2 or 3 years is a city in North India called Allahabad. Now, Allahabad is uniquely located and is said to be somewhat holy to Hindus because it's at the point where the two rivers, the Ganga, that's the Ganges, and the Yamuna meet. And we've changed that name now. The government has changed that name now to Prayagraj. And Prayagraj was supposed to be the historical place where those two rivers and another mythological river met. Now, this is something that's really strange because no one knows whether this Prayagraj is the same Prayagraj that was there 2000, 2500 years ago. And people do know that Allahabad was a city that was kind of first built by the Mughal Emperor Akbar 600 years ago. It's it's this sort of parochialism that actually diminishes the history of a country because it's the kind of the cancel culture, the denialism, the
Yes.
entire debate around that, uh, which is disturbing, which
This
is
is
disturbing, and
this is
that's
sort of the traditional nationalist version of cancel culture.
yeah, yeah,
Yes, it is.
exactly.
But it's not unrelated to cancel culture. It's anytime you try to force a name change or a topographical change, you tearing down statues or tearing down memorials in service to an ideology and against the natural progression of language. Language changes, of course it does. I mean, we call Oxenford Oxford now. That's a natural change. It's not. It wasn't imposed on the place, but when you try to do that, you are always doing so at the expense of the way the place is understood in popular culture, the the way people feel about its history, the way it's appreciated by the people who actually live there. And it's always a violent act. It's never really a good idea. Um,
It's a lot more than that, Claire, because the minute you do something like this, then you are attempting to cancel out something that's actually happened in history.
Yeah,
that's what I
So
mean.
are we going to deny by changing the name Bombay to Mumbai? Are we going to deny that before the Portuguese came in and before the East India Company came into Bombay, it was just 7 islands with fisher folk living around? So are we going to deny that? Are we going to deny that there was a strong Mughal presence in Allahabad for about 500 years? Uh, uh, so what we're doing with this sort of a cancel culture is we're denying history. And the more we get into this, the more people start doing this, and the more we get into a nationalist, parochial environment where we're just listening to each other say the same thing, the echo chambers, the worse this gets. And which is the reason why we do need the cosmopolitan globalists, because we need to understand history as much as we need to understand social mores.
Right.
Yeah, the other really important argument for globalism, cosmopolitanism, is that unless you're connected to the experiences of people in other countries, you are cutting yourself off from the collective wisdom of humanity, which is an ocean,
Exactly.
and inserting yourself into a stream, a very narrow stream. I mean, the United States is a very significant part of global culture, but it's not the whole thing. There is, there are many things Americans can learn from other countries. There are many experiences and stories that Americans would be well served by learning and knowing. And to cut oneself off from it deliberately, to turn oneself into North Korea for no good reason, is unfathomable. I mean, North Korea is the extreme example, but that is the extreme example of autarky and parochialism, and it's not something anyone would wish to emulate. You would think.
Yeah, I mean, America, one of America's great strengths is its popular culture that we export throughout the world. But at the same time, a good percentage of that popular culture is us ripping off, Japanese culture, or
Of course,
taking stories from everywhere around and repackaging them and reusing them. Somebody talk or
and
and this is something deep in the English language, by the way, that
mhm.
the famous quote somebody said this in the 90s on a blog about how English doesn't just borrow words from other languages, it tracks other languages down to back alleys, knocks them out, and rifles through their pocket looking for vocabulary.
That's
Uh,
right. That's right. I mean, it's unlike French, where the Académie Française is very, very scrupulous about extirpating foreign influences from the language, and it's taken very seriously. And thus, the French lexicon is tiny compared to the English lexicon. It's a beautiful little language; it's jewel-like, but you just can't say as many things as you can in English.
yeah.
Um, English is a colonizing language, and the United States has been exposed mostly through immigration to ideas
Mhm.
from all around the world, which it makes its own, which it appropriates. And you now have these forces from both right and left, and the left saying that to do so is it's something negative, cultural appropriation, as opposed to entirely positive, generative, and creative. And the right saying it doesn't even want these influences to be present in the first place. And what a sterile tiny culture ours would be if we really reduced it to nothing more than Tucker Carlson suggested we wanted an Anglo-Saxon culture. Well, this is a very tiny little culture. There's not it's if you want to be a country like Finland, sure, but we're not. We shouldn't be, and even Finland isn't.
I also think it's scandalous that he's excluding the Jutes like that.
Yeah.
Now, Vivek may not get that, but the traditional history is as the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, who are from basically Denmark, if I'm correct, Jutland,
I
this little
know.
peninsula. Okay, yeah, Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. So whenever I hear Anglo-Saxon, I think, well, what about the Jutes? Why are you excluding them? But
Yeah, but here, sorry.
go ahead.
I was just looking at it a little differently from, here in India, we might look at it completely differently. Uh, the argument would be that you've had 200 years of colonialism. America is a land that's 200 and so many years old. Uh, England's a country that came and colonized us for 140 years or something. And we are appropriating nuances that therefore come from an alien land, and we're forgetting anything that goes back to our own history, our own culture, which predates a lot of old civilizations. Uh, and and the attempt, therefore, is in a sense uh, the necessity of building pride in the old Indian culture. But the way it's done is that it ends up saying that this is it. And we ought to reject anything and everything that comes from somewhere else, which means that we end up with that same parochial nationalism that you're talking about, but from a completely different perspective. We're coming at it not from 200 years of history and then trying to go back and appropriate an Anglo-Saxon ethos, but we coming at it from a place that's 2,000 years old, and we coming at it from a place that says that you came and you dominated us and you gave us your McDonald's and we don't need you. So it's two different, it's the same coin, but it's two sides of the same coin.
Well, what's underlying it in both cases is cultural insecurity. A sense
Yes.
that something is wrong and we don't quite understand what it is, but it has something to do with foreign influence.
Well, Claire, I
Yes.
mean, I think if you're talking about your difficulty in understanding what happened, how did this happen in America? I think one statistic one statistic I've been looking at recently that I think is very clarifying about that is in the last 2 decades, and this wasn't clear until fairly recently, but the size and continuation of the trend. But in the last 2 to 3 decades, religious belief in America has sort of gone off a cliff. That is, membership in churches. I think just recently, membership in churches dropped below 50%. And this was like 70% constantly up until about the 1990s. And then it sort of dropped off a cliff. And the number of people who, and as an atheist, used to be like, okay, I'd see these polls and there may be 3 to 5% of us out there. And now the number of people who are either atheists or have no particular religious belief, they're becoming almost as, we're competing with the Catholics in terms of how, in terms of the size of that group. Or competing with most of the other major denominations. So I think that's part of the cultural insecurity in America, especially behind Trumpism and the evangelical right, is this idea that Christianity is being wiped out, it's disappearing. I think they're somewhat get catastrophic about it, but they experience this as we're under threat. And rather than look within or see how we can, have more to offer to people, they do that, what a lot of people naturally do, look outside to the threat. It's them out there that's causing this to happen.
Yes, I think that's certainly an important source of it. It's an interesting question why religious belief has dropped off as precipitously as it has. Is it just the inevitable secularizing influence of development, which the United States was long considered an exception to this,
Right.
and perhaps development just caught up with us? Or is there some other reason for it? I wrote a book not all that long ago, about 15 years ago, in which I discussed how exceptional the United States was compared to Europe, which is so secular in its religious vocation. And now the United States is suffering from all the pathologies that I once noticed as being peculiar to Europe: the high suicide rate, the sense of overwhelming despair, or the loss of cultural confidence. I thought this was a European phenomenon. I didn't realize it was a Western phenomenon, and the United States was just a little slower to catch up. And I don't fully understand the reasons for this. I do think it has something to do with our inability to maintain upward mobility at the rate that we once thought. I don't know to what extent that upward mobility was a reality as opposed to a myth in itself, but once it was widely believed in the United States that upward mobility was a real prospect for everyone. And I don't think it's as widely believed anymore. There has been a real hollowing out of the middle class. These are problems that everyone discusses, but I think they're real. And I think our failure to win any of the wars that we started in the wake of September 11th has been catastrophic for our national esteem as well. I think there's a real sense that something has gone off the rails. And we're also beset by weirdo epidemics, the obesity epidemic, the mass shooting epidemic. Everyone's looking around and saying something about our society is not right. The healthy societies don't have problems like this. And I don't think we really have the diagnosis. I don't think we really understand. These are complex issues, but it's very easy to say, who's the author of the Flight 92?
Flight 93.
Yeah, the Republic is dying.
Right.
The Republic is dying, as he said. I don't think the Republic is dying, but I think it sure will if people believe that it's dying.
Well, that's the thing, is you talk about the hollowing out of the middle class. I'm not sure that's actually true, that the middle class is being hollowed out. I think that it has become a narrative, though, and perhaps the way to get into the middle class has changed. That you don't do it by getting a factory job, you do it by getting a college degree.
Right.
And so because of that, there's certain cultural there's certain areas and certain cultural groups who then feel excluded. And that's sort of the nature of things, that in the nature of change, there's always some group that is caught on the sort of the wrong side of the change. I see it as being an ideological, a sense that we don't know what we stand for anymore, and a failure to grasp or to transmit the ideological underpinnings of the country. And I think that's sort of how the left and right work together in a way in the culture wars in the US, is that, if you go to the left for its history of America, they'll say, oh, America's based, get the 1619 Project. America's based on racism and exploitation. And you don't get the story about America being based as an Enlightenment project on Enlightenment ideas. And then you get the right then saying, oh, look, they're bad mouthing America, so we need to go, defend America by reference to to the opposite of Enlightenment ideas, to this sort of backlash against Enlightenment ideas. And so the actual ideas on which America was based get lost in this
Yeah.
war between these two different sides of the culture war.
Yeah.
But one thing I want to look at here is that we used to think in the Cold War, especially, left-wing dictatorship, left-wing totalitarianism was the big global threat.
hmm
And in the US, there are a lot of people who are still focused on, the left wing, the cancel culture and political correctness and, being quote unquote woke. That's the big threat to liberty. But globally right now, I mean, what I'm seeing is that it's the sort of a more quote unquote right wing. I mean, these categories are kind of vague, but more of a nationalist authoritarianism
Yeah.
that is becoming the dominant trend. Or you call it Caesarism, I think, at the
Yeah,
Cosmopolitan
yeah, yeah.
Globalist.
There are a lot of names for it: hybrid democracy, illiberal democracy. It's certainly the global trend, and that we can say authoritatively. This has been cataloged and tracked by innumerable political scientists. Liberal democracy is in precipitous decline. It's being replaced by an odd phenomenon, one we didn't see coming 20 years ago, in which elections are held, but everything that makes democracy meaningful is hollowed out. So the one thing we did succeed in exporting was the ideal of democracy, that legitimacy comes through the ballot box. But we didn't do so well in exporting the idea of liberal democracy. There are other things that must be associated with the holding of elections for it to be a meaningful democracy, including having two viable political parties, for example, and a free press and a rule of law and an independent judiciary. These are things that haven't caught on as well as the idea of legitimating the leader's authority by means of elections. To bring it back to what the Cosmopolitan Globalist is doing, one of the reasons that you see this kind of polarization, which allows the ideas that underpin the United States to disappear, and which also is a big factor in bringing these kinds of governments to power, is precisely because the media is no longer what it was. It no longer performs the same role in any society that it did prior to the rise of the internet. I mean, right now, the economy of the media is driven by clicks, and one of the ways that you get people to click is through outrage, which fuels polarization. And the only way to stay in business is to cater to your click, so to speak, so the CLIQUE kind, by feeding them ever more radical articles and whipping them into an ever greater frenzy against the outgroup. Then we're
We can
seeing
call
this
this
pattern.
clickbait.
Exactly, and we're seeing this pattern replicated around the world, and it's deleterious everywhere where it's happening. So there's really a need for a kind of media that is more reflective and more analytical, and that refuses to participate in this economy. Now, whether we can expand this model out to a scale that it has a significant ameliorative impact on this trend, I don't know, but certainly we can get it started.
Yeah. One of the things that you, when you launched the Cosmopolitan Globalist, one of the very first things you put out, I believe, was talking about how we've emphasized democracy. We need to emphasize liberal democracy, and
Yeah,
that's one of the reasons why, when I started up Symposium, I wanted to have this idea. The emphasis isn't on democracy; the emphasis is on liberalism, in that broad
that's
political
right.
philosopher sense of advocacy of liberty, because that's really the goal of democracy, is as a safeguard. The goal of voting and representation and all that is as a safeguard to individual freedom and to
Yes,
having a
and
liberal society.
we're in complete agreement about that, but I think it's become very poorly understood. I think these would have once been considered truisms and cliches and commonplaces among Americans, but it's not anymore.
And also, I think that people don't realize the extent to which liberalism is also a safeguard for democracy. That when you don't have a free society to support voting and representation, it becomes, as you put it, basically the press becomes an echo chamber for the regime, and voting becomes a way of it becomes a rigged exercise as a rubber stamp for the authoritarian leader.
That's right. A liberal society is much more complex. It's much richer than an illiberal society, and it's something that it seems to me it just overwhelmingly a priori obvious that you would wish to have as opposed to in liberal society, but many people no longer think so. So there's really a big ideological battle ahead of us, maybe even more than an ideological battle.
Well, the thing.
There's another uh, there's another uh, angle to this. In We do have two sides of the debate. If you look at it, whether I'm looking at it from India, whether I'm looking at the media in the UK or Europe or America, we do have two sides of the debate. There would be a Fox on one hand, and there would be a CNN on the other. So you do have two sides of the debate. But what is the danger is that the audiences are getting polarized. They don't want to hear the other point of view anymore.
Mm.
They just want to know what I think suits me. So this is what I want to know. This is all that I want to know. And therefore, this is all I shall know.
Right.
Yes, they're being
That's the
siloed.
way, that's the way media is going.
Yeah.
Well,
And
so
so
you
the liberalism of ideas, because eventually you've got to have freedom of ideas, and you've got to have a platform where there are different ideas from different sources, from drawn from all over the world or drawn through world history from different regions of the world, all coming and sort of coalescing into one. And that's what makes it richer, but that's not happening because you have the strong polarization that's driving things one way or the other. And you have people simply saying, this is all I want.
On the one hand, I think we do have this sort of new model of authoritarianism that's sort of been perfected in some places like Russia. China has gone from communism to fascism with a rather smooth transition. But on the other hand, I look out there and I also see that the story of the current era is also that there's a global resistance, and that I look to places like Hong Kong or to Belarus,
Mm-hmm.
and you see tremendously courageous battles in favor of a liberal outlook. And the other thing is, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you two is that I just started a publication symposium that's supposed to be in defense of liberalism. You've just started the Cosmopolitan Globalist. There's about a half a dozen other things that I could name, that people who have started new organizations, new publications.
Mm-hmm.
So we are seeing this sort of, within the West and across the world. We also are seeing that the rise of nationalist authoritarianism or various other forms of authoritarianism is also calling forth a resistance and new institutions and new organizations, hopefully, that will rise up and grow to be
Yes, we're
able to push
healthy
back at.
antibodies.
Yeah.
Yeah, authoritarianism has always existed. Uh, Even if you look at the 90s or even 10 years ago, there was authoritarianism. Or you look at the 1800s, 1900s, the 20th century, there was always authoritarianism. That
And
wasn't the point.
it was usually
The
much
point
more the
was
norm than it is today.
there were places where you could have a free debate of ideas. And the danger is that it's in those places where you could once have a free debate of ideas. The ideas might still be floating around, but then people just want to pick up what they think is right, what suits them at that particular moment. And this is what appeals to me. This is what appeals to my limited thinking. They just don't want to go beyond that and say that, look, how do I open my mind out to another source of ideas, which might make my knowledge deeper, wider, make me a better person, make me a better citizen of the world. That's not
Yeah.
happening.
Yeah, we've seen the world has gone in the opposite trajectory from that which we assumed after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when most of us really did sincerely ascribe to some version of the end of history theory, assuming that from now on the model of a liberal democracy was the only real model left. Everything else had been shown to not to work, and the unfree world would become progressively freer and more integrated with the free world. And what has in fact happened is the free world has become less free. And that's very frightening, because if there's nothing left to the free world, there's not much of a light of hope for the rest of the world.
Well, I'm glad that we have you out there and other people then trying to push back and create institutions that will revive that tradition and give new life to it. I'm going to give you one last chance to go do a plug for the Cosmopolitan Globalist.
Thank you. Well, you can find us by Googling Cosmopolitan Globalist and subscribe. You can do two things. You can sign up, which means the newsletter will be delivered to your mailbox every day, or you can subscribe, which means paying for it, which we'd really appreciate if people did, because right now that's our biggest obstacle to becoming bigger, is that we don't have enough money. So we'd really appreciate your subscriptions and sharing the newsletter with your friends and becoming involved in the community.
And more than that, I promise you that the Cosmopolitan Globalist is going to give you a whole set of new ideas, new thoughts, new ways of looking at things that you haven't had before.
That's our plan.
Yeah, well, I'm a regular reader and I've been enjoying it greatly. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
I'm Rob Trosinski with Symposium Magazine. My guests today have been Claire Berlinski and Vivek Kelkar of the Cosmopolitan Globalist. You can subscribe to this on YouTube. You can subscribe to our podcast, and you can always find more ideas and interesting conversation at symposium.substack.com. Thank you for joining the conversation.